His name is Jim Doty. He's a clinical professor of neurosurgery at Stanford University and founder and director of the Center of Compassion and Altruism Research and Education. Watch. So how does a guy who's an atheist become, seemingly pals with the Pope and with the Dalai Lama and you name it, pretty much everybody?
Well, it just shows you that those types of individuals who essentially are respected throughout the world, it's not a matter of your dogma, it's a matter of your heart. And they can read people really, really quick. And if they think that you're inauthentic, if you're dishonest, they don't spend any time with you.
Right.
But if you come to them with no agenda other than to connect, frankly, to give unlimited love, compassion, you're embraced, and there's no other secret than that.
Tell me a little bit about, because you say you lived in poverty. You by the time you were 13 had an awful childhood.
Right. My father was an alcoholic. My mother was an invalid. She had had a stroke and was partially paralyzed. We were on public assistance. I had no mentors. Neither of my parents had gone to college. And it was difficult. And don't get me wrong, I was not abused in any way other than the abuse of that environment. But when I was 13, by that time I had become angry, was filled with despair and hopelessness. And when you have nothing to lose, then it doesn't matter what happens to you. You don't care anymore. And I became involved in activities which I'm not proud of, and using drugs. And it wasn't even because I wanted to, I just had no future, nothing else to do. And at 13, I walked into a magic shop, and the owner wasn't there, but his mother was there. And she knew nothing about magic. But, and I tell people prior to this, I felt like a leaf being blown by an ill wind. It was just here or there, I had no stability. And this woman, after talking to me for about 15 or 20 minutes, and I'll tell you, she looked like, and when I say this, you probably know what I mean, an earth mother. She was wearing sort of a moo-moo and flowing gray hair. And she said, I really like you. I'm here for 6 weeks. If you come in here every day, I'll teach you something that I think could change your life. And I frankly had nothing better to do. It wasn't because I had great insight. So I showed up, and for 2 hours a day for 6 weeks, she spent with me. And she taught me a technique of, if you will, mind training or meditation, intertwined with a visualization technique, intertwined with the power of positive thinking and self-hypnosis. And at the end of it, and I tell people this is my first experience with neuroplasticity or change in your brain. I went from having a worldview of limited to no possibilities to unlimited possibilities. And that fundamental interaction with this woman changed my life. It opened the world to me and allowed me to go to college, or believe I could go to college, go to medical.
Before then, you had no chance of going to college.
No, I didn't even understand the process. And in fact, the way I applied to college is almost laughable. I was sitting next to a girl in my science class, and she was filling out an application. And I asked her what she was doing. She said, well, I'm filling out my college application. I had no clue. And I said, really? I said, where are you going? And she said, UC Irvine. And then she looked at me and said, where are you going? I said, I'm going to UC Irvine. And she said, well, why is your application done? I said, I haven't received it yet. And she said, well, I have an extra. I applied to one college, that was it. And wow. That's how I got into college. And the extraordinary thing, though, is when we talk about this technique that this woman taught me, it made me understand that, well, when you put these ideas and this intention in the right place, anything is possible, but it may not always be a straight line. And so here I met this person who had this extra application. And the extraordinary thing after that, though, was that I had been influenced. I saw a doctor when I was in 4th grade. And I was so impressed with this person because he was so kind to me and what he did and how he seemed to just so connect. And I wanted to be a doctor, but I had no clue. And I was so unprepared for college that I essentially flunked out. and I was asked to leave, and I refused. And they let me come back in, and by the time I went to apply to medical school, my GPA was 2.53 out of 4. And the average GPA to go into medical school was 3.79. And I went to our pre-med committee, and I said, because you had to have an interview and to get a letter of recommendation, they said, we're not going to give you an interview because it's a waste of our time. Can you imagine being told that interacting with you is a waste of somebody's time? It's just horrible. So I told them I wouldn't leave until they interacted with me. So they gave me an appointment, and I questioned them and I said, what right do you have to deny a person their dream? Who gave you that right? There's not one bit of evidence that shows that beyond an average level or above average level intelligence, you cannot be a doctor. And at the end of our probably one-sided discussion, frankly, they were crying. And what happened there was they took what they perceived as me being an object, not a person, but a number to a human being. And when you look at somebody as a human being who has a life, who has hopes, who has fears, who has dreams, and you see them as that, it changes everything. And it changed that. And they actually ended up giving me the highest recommendation.
Wow.
They could. And the weird part of the end of the story of this is that as I was leaving, there was a brochure, and it talked about a summer enrichment program for socioeconomically disadvantaged students and minority students at Tulane. But the deadline had passed. I called the lady, convinced her to let me in. She let me in. And so I applied to one medical school, and that was Tulane. And they accepted me with that GPA and no degree. And to this date, I'm the only person who's been accepted in that fashion. But the end of this story is that I ended up being a neurosurgeon, as you know, and an entrepreneur. And following Hurricane Katrina, the dean had become depressed and had left, and you couldn't blame him. And you know, Tulane is in New Orleans. They were looking for a new dean, and the new dean was from Harvard and wanted an endowed chair. And I had actually donated funds, and so I ended up endowing his chair. So the dean of the medical school is now the Doty professor.
Unbelievable.
After the hurricane, I contributed to redoing the library, and also set up scholarships for children, socioeconomically disadvantaged students who are going to do service. And I'm also on the Board of Governors now. So it tells you everything can come full circle. And telling somebody that they have no value is really a very, very wrong thing to do.
It was the magic shop, the first kindness?
Well, I want to say the first kindness. I mean, my parents meant well, but you know, it's easy to look at somebody, let's say somebody who's an alcoholic, and say it's their own fault they're an alcoholic. I don't know what drove my father to be an alcoholic. I do know deep down he loved me. He showed me several examples of that. But, you know, this was a burden he had to bear, and he could never overcome that. You know, it wasn't my mother's fault she had a stroke. So, you know, people end up in these circumstances, and it's not necessarily their fault at all. And, you know, for people to somehow think that poverty, someone in poverty wants to be there, I don't know a single person who wants to be in poverty.
No.
And in fact, if you look at the vast majority of people, they're not there because they choose to be there. Yes, there are some people who've actively made bad decisions, but the vast majority of people are victims of circumstances. And it's, again, when you look at that situation in that manner, again, you're much more gentle with these people, and you're much more understanding. And in my own story, how many people have we lost who have the potential to do great things simply because they were born in poverty. And in America, there's no reason that a child should be hungry. There's no reason that a child should not be cared for. There isn't.
You are a guy who walks the walk on this, and probably one of the greatest examples that I've heard of giving when it hurts, or giving when everybody around you says, don't do that, that's crazy. You want to tell me about when you had crashed and you had given your word that you were going to endow a...
Yeah, so I had ended up, the rest of my story is, I ended up becoming a very successful neurosurgeon and ultimately a professor at Stanford University. But I also became an entrepreneur. And during the dot-com period, I had ended up being very successful as an angel investor in some companies that had gone public. And I was worth tens of millions of dollars. And in fact, I was living large, if you will. But I still felt the need to think about giving, because I always felt that if we're successful and we've been blessed with gifts that allow us to succeed, that we should think of those less fortunate. But what happened was, after the dot-com crashed, I went from being worth tens of millions of dollars and having a significant line of credit, which I had used to buy a penthouse and a villa in Florence and an island. It was gone. And my Ferrari was gone. And so I had made a commitment, though, to charity, and I wanted to live up to it. And I surveyed all my friends about this. And I had stock in a company of which I had run, a biomedical company that had yet to go public. And I elected to give every share of stock away to fulfill the requirements that I personally felt I had. I had no legal obligation to do that. And again, I surveyed my friends, and they said I was an idiot. And I went ahead and chose to give the money away, or the stock. And ultimately, I was still effectively bankrupt. And that company went public for $1.3 billion. And I ended up giving tens of millions of dollars to charity. But that act of giving had the most profound effect ultimately on my life. Because having all this material success, while on the one hand, in terms of what we call hedonic pleasure, you know, just responding to the senses and, you know, being able to go here and meet this person and do these things, on one level that was wonderful. On the other level, it was very empty. And it reset the gauge to me to reflect back on what my own journey was. And when I did that, it was okay to give it all away. And that has profoundly affected my life in the most positive way, and has allowed me to do the work that I do, which is in part not only being a neurosurgeon, but I have a center at Stanford where we actually study the neuroscience of compassion and altruism and the value proposition of acting that way with intention. And that value proposition is huge in terms of your physiology and, frankly, your longevity.